There we go, now it's on.
No, thanks. Thanks, Jeff, for reminding me that I forgot something. So the kinds of foods that are available within a given ecology affects the kinds of foraging behaviors that people engage in. And of course, there's a dead squirrel in the middle of this picture, and it's a fox squirrel. If you go up to the woodlands of Indiana, Illinois, well, Illinois doesn't have any trees, but if they had trees, they'd have squirrels. I live in Iowa. I don't have any squirrels on my property because it's field all around it, and the squirrel would have to cross all this empty area in order to get to a tree. So I have no squirrels on my property, much to the chagrin of both of my dogs, since they want to hunt, or at least bark at squirrels. According to Gilmore in 1990, in those cultures where the environment is harsh and requires courage and physical prowess to secure a living, cultures of masculinity that value the strength and the toughness of males are more likely to emerge. So if we look at this culture, there's a reason why the school mascot are the warriors. This is a fairly harsh environment, and because of that, in order to survive, you had to be a warrior. You had to have a warrior culture. So masculinity was extremely important in this area because of that. And some of the more storied warriors come from this part of the world. If you think about television and the movies that we've seen, what are the tribes that people are always talking about? It isn't really the Navajo, it isn't really the Pueblo, but it's the Apache and the Comanche. It seems like they were fixated on those two tribes. So if you watch an old cowboy movie, it will probably, and there is a native enemy, it will probably be the Apache or the Comanche who are their enemies. And that they are the people from this area. They are two tribes from this area. And so why do they talk about the Comanche and the Apache rather than the Navajo and the Pueblo Indians? Because those were the last ones that they fought. The Apache were the last tribe to be defeated in battle, were the Apaches. Why don't they talk about the Sioux? The Sioux wars ended in the 1890s. The Apache wars went into the beginning of the 20th century. And of course the Comanche were a storied group of individuals that the federal government couldn't conquer until the 1870s. Okay. We don't talk about the people we didn't have to fight. We talk about the people that we did have to fight. Places where large game is hunted, of course, these are places where we talk about a strong masculine culture. The Northern Plains, all those tribes. The federal government left them alone. Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, that whole section of the country was the last place that they invaded. And because of that, of course, they were able to maintain themselves for an extended length of time, and they became a strong buffalo hunting culture. The Cheyenne, the Sioux. Places where risky deep-sea fishing is performed. Now, of course, we don't know that much about this because we don't really deal with any indigenous groups that are that have that this is the way they find their food. But if we did, and we can talk about it right now, as a matter of fact, I've got an example. On the South Pacific island of Truk, men traditionally have to go on dangerous deep-sea fishing expeditions to secure food for their families. The Truckees greatly value masculinity, which is manifested by a young man engaging in frequent violent drunken melees with knives and clubs. So these guys are drinking themselves into a violent state and then attacking one another. But it's a culture where this is accepted. So if we think of the old cowboys, isn't that the way the cowboys were? They'd go into a saloon and everybody would drink, and all of a sudden somebody would get angry and they'd start some kind of a saloon fight. Isn't that the way we think of cowboys? Yeah, okay. A very masculine culture, and of course the cowboy has become iconic in the United States as the epitome of masculinity, for that very reason. The idea that you live by your strength, the strength of your arm, not by your intellect. And of course, when they tried to civilize the West, of course the cowboys came out first to conquer the West, and then the civilized individuals came in and tried to conquer the cowboys. But it wasn't always that easy. Movies like Free Range, isn't that what it is? It's got Kevin Costner in it. Where they're trying to, some guy has decided that all this grass is his even though he doesn't own it. Okay, and so they come through with a herd of cattle, and then they get in trouble and they start killing each other.
For some reason I think of the Magnificent Seven.
I'm sorry?
Magnificent Seven?
Magnificent Seven has to do with a group of bandits, Mexican bandits.
Oh, okay.
And then they go down into Mexico to help this village, because the bandits are always coming in and stealing all their food. They take their whatever women they want.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm not speaking music, so I'm going to be there.
And then they go down there, and actually I think only 3 of them survive. Of the 7, only 3 of them survive. Anyway, the Truck Islanders, they have this sense of masculinity. In cultures where the environment is more benign and food is plentiful and more easily acquired, more androgynous gender roles are more likely to emerge. Men in Tahiti do not need to hunt and fish. Fish are readily available in relatively shallow lagoons, so all they have to do is walk out and catch them. So because there is no struggle to survive, masculinity isn't as important. You wouldn't call the Tahitians a warrior society. So when Western man first landed on Tahiti, they didn't have to worry about the Tahitians trying to kill them. However, when they landed on Hawaii, they did. Several of them were killed. The Cook Islanders, Captain Cook. Eventually he called it the Sandwich Islands. Okay, so this is really kind of fascinating. So what kind of a masculine culture do we have in the United States today? Is there any place in the United States where you have to struggle to survive? Well, poor people have to struggle to survive, don't they? But if you live in New York City, what's the struggle? So it's really kind of fascinating. It's really kind of fascinating because about 15 years ago they developed this term metrosexual. So we have people that are heterosexual, we have people that are homosexual, and now we have this concept of metrosexual. There was a television show once upon a long time ago, about 10 years ago, called Men in Trees. It was about 2 women from New York City who have to go to Alaska to do something. I can't remember what the original reason for them being in Alaska was, but what they discovered was that these individuals in Alaska, it's a real struggle to survive. So the men that they ran into in Alaska were different from the metrosexuals that they were running into in New York City. They were more masculine, and they found that more attractive. And that's, of course, what happened. Anne Hesh was one of the female leads. Fascinating stuff. So maybe we're moving toward a more androgynous. We have become more androgynous because there's not so much struggle, and because there's not so much struggle, it's a lot easier to survive. And since it's easier to survive, people are starting, we've lost our need for masculinity, for men who are, put themselves out there. But one place where we don't have that problem is in the military, right? And we just came back from war. Right? Actually, we're not done with Afghanistan yet. We're pretty much, well, we're not even done with Iraq yet. But of course, military people, and if you've ever been around military people, they're just a little bit more masculine than other people on just out there, I guess. This is interesting, isn't it? So things may be changing, if you think about it.
Wasn't it the same thing? They're saying like they have a book about a boy wearing a what's it called, the princess, or the guy with the little son's a princess, or where it's like girl clothes. Isn't that what you kind of mean, in a way? Like the androgyny of like when we put more masculine stuff and boys who wear more girly stuff.
Right, right. So as people moved west, and it was more of a struggle, less of that was taking place. Okay. But back east, yeah, that was taking place back east. You have President Theodore Roosevelt. When he was a child, he was very weak and fragile. They dressed him in dresses. So in order for him to become more manly, they shipped him out to a ranch in Montana, and he became a cowboy. And then he touted that type of lifestyle the rest of his life. The fact that you needed to be manly, he shot things, that kind of stuff. There's virtually no warfare and feuding on Tahiti, and there is little evidence that masculinity is a matter of much concern with Tahitians. The harsher the environment and the scarcer the resources, the more manhood is stressed. Environment shapes lifestyle, if you think about it. So we need to struggle. The more struggle there is, the more likely that you're going to have a more masculine centric society. Now this is really kind of interesting, because if you think of Europe and you think of the Europeans, we think of them as not that masculine. But if we go to the Arab world, the Middle East, and we're dealing with not just the Israelis, but we're also dealing with the Arabs. We're dealing with a very masculine culture. But then again, they live in an environment that is very difficult. I mean, it's the desert, and they have to carve things out of the desert. So it's a very strong masculine culture. As it turns out, the Muslim religion touts masculinity, as does Christianity, but sometimes it doesn't fit as well. So if the environment is an easy environment to live in, you really don't need tough guys to survive. You don't need to be a tough guy in order to survive. I don't know how far to take this thing out. Does it mean that we're becoming wimps because Bosch's is right down the road and we don't have to kill our meat? We can just go to Bosch's and buy a leg of lamb or something? I don't know.
I think it made people lazy. Many people don't farm or hunt no more.
Exactly.
Very few people farm now.
Very few people farm.
Everybody would rather go to Bashas and buy it than
Exactly.
farm.
And hardly anybody hunts anymore. Very few people hunt. So if we look at that culture, if we look at individuals that actually do hunt, we see that they, they have a different idea about the world. These are the guys that voted for Trump. The hunters. They're worried about people taking their guns away. They're worried about their Second Amendment rights. Really kind of fascinating. I don't want to take this out too far because then I'll start insulting all my relatives back home, so I better not do that. I know. So your environment does shape your lifestyle. In 1532, Juan Pizarro and 168 soldiers. He only had 168 conquistadors. And the only reason they call them conquistadors is because they conquered people. If they hadn't conquered anybody, they would have just called them soldiers. But they were conquistadors. He only had 168 people, plus he had allies. He had other indigenous allies. But most of the fighting was taking place with these 168 soldiers. He met the Incan Emperor Atahualpa and captured the emperor and killed 7,000 Incan warriors. He lost hardly anybody. So Atahualpa was in this huge mass of soldiers, and they waded their way through, killing people as they went, and they captured Atahualpa. Now, what made them better warriors than anybody else? The Incans had conquered other indigenous groups, but they weren't European groups. They weren't used to fighting against people from Europe. They had never seen horses before. They had never seen steel weapons before. And it only took them a year to take over the entire Incan Empire, which was huge. I mean, it was all of Peru, of that whole area. And it just took them a year to conquer the whole area. The only time the Incans were able to kill any Spaniards was if they ambushed them. And if you've ever been in the Andes, of course I've been there, so you follow these relatively narrow trails, and the only way they were able to kill them was if they dropped a rock on their heads, because they wore steel helmets. So it had to be a pretty damn big rock in order to kill them. But that's the only way they could defeat them. If they ambushed them, then they could defeat them. But if they had to fight them in open warfare, they couldn't defeat them. So why did this take place? Why was he able to do this? Juan Pizarro. Proximal means direct and immediate. Proximal cause of the Spanish success would be the Spanish political organization drew on thousands of years of written history, ocean-going ships, steel swords and armor, horses, and smallpox, which actually decimated the Incans. Atahualpa had just been the emperor for a number of weeks, and that's because the person that was the emperor before, the person that had all of these individuals as his allies, he had died of smallpox, and so Atahualpa took over. And if you know anything about Incan politics, of course, you had to forge a relationship with all of the people around you in order to have an army to maintain your empire. So part of what happened was a breakdown of the political structure of the Incans. Incans were fascinating people. So why were the Spanish so strong? Well, they had years of written history. They had centuries of written history. They could sail ships. The Incans, of course, didn't have ships. They were along the coast, but they didn't really want to go anywhere. They really didn't need to go anywhere. The Spanish, of course, sailed across the ocean, and they had all these years of warfare, open warfare, between Spain and Portugal, between Spain and England, between Spain and France. So they had this history of violence. And because of that, they were far more violent than the Incans were. So you can imagine this individual that is used to putting on his armor. Well, I'm talking about the Incans now. He's used to putting on his armor and carrying his stone shield, or he had his shield and his stone axe. And of course, people just fled from him because they were afraid of him. But of course, in Spain, in order to be a warrior, you had to prove that you could kill people. And they'd been doing this for centuries, fighting against all of these individuals. And because there was so much fighting that had taken place, they developed all of this intricate military garb, armor. They had steel swords, Of course, a steel sword versus a stone axe made out of wood and stone, who's going to win? Well, the steel's going to win every time. Unless you can get in the first blow before the sword comes into play, this sword's going to win every time. And that's the proximal cause of why they were able to conquer the Spanish. As you can see, they're throwing rocks down on the Spanish, but of course it didn't, they lost. This is, I've actually seen this place. This is Sacsayhuaman, which is just north of Cuzco in Peru. And this still exists. This whole area still exists. The Spanish, of course, came in, and one of the reasons that they did what they did to the Incans was because they thought there was something wrong with them. Sexuality was different in the Incan Empire. How can I explain this? Wait a minute. The Incan emperors, they used to mummify their bodies. And the first thing they did was they would have sex with the mummified bodies, as confusing as that is. I know that sounds horrible. Okay. So they were having oral sex with a dead body is what they were having. And that's one of the ways they made contact. Okay, so the reason that I am an emperor is because I am in contact with the past. And that's where I get my power, from the past. That's how royal families work. But this is very literal. They would mummify the bodies and they would put them in niches. So in order for them to be in charge, in order for anybody to accept anything they said, the mummies would have to be sitting there. And one of the things that they did was have sex with the mummified bodies, as god-awful as that sounds. And because of that, of course, the Spanish were just really grossed out, and so they decided that there was something wrong with the Incans, so it's one of the reasons why they killed them all and changed their culture. They also tried to tear down all their buildings, but then they realized, oh my goodness, these things are really put together better than anything we have in Europe, so they weren't able to do it. But Sacsayhuaman actually still exists. They weren't able to tear it down. The Spanish destroyed everything they possibly could. Any structure that they possibly could tear down, they tore down. Distal means long-term and indirect. The Spanish came from a history of environments with food sources that supported large populations. One of the beauties of the Incan Empire is they were able to get a lot of food from it. Hello? Hello? No idea who that was. Only my wife has my telephone number, so usually if I get a telephone call, it's a robot or it's my wife. My wife's not a robot, of course. Okay, so the beauty of the Incan Empire was if you go to Peru now, they have all these terraced fields. And in each elevation of field, they grew different crops. So you'd see these terraces going up 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 feet, and they would grow different types of peppers, different types of potatoes in all of these areas. So the Incas, one of the reasons that they had an empire was because of the food sources that they had. And most of the food sources had to do with tubers, they had to do with chilies and with potatoes, as odd as that sounds. So when I was in the Andes, I actually went up into a village that was like at 9,000 feet. And they fed me this stew made out of different types of potatoes. And there were like 10 different types of potatoes in there. They all had different flavors. It was like eating, I don't know, carrots and broccoli and cauliflower, different vegetables, but these were all potatoes. Some of them were purple, there were orange ones in there were white ones in there. It's really quite colorful and very, very tasty. So the Incans were able to do this. The Incans, they didn't have any large animals. They transported with llamas of one ilk or another, alpacas. They ate small animals. They had these rock rabbits that they would eat. They would eat guinea pigs, as horrible as that sounds. So I decided when I was in Cusco I was going to eat some guinea pig. So I ordered a guinea pig, and it was like the most expensive thing on the menu. And I started to eat it, and I went, you know, this tastes like a squirrel. I'd eaten squirrel, of course, I'm from Indiana, and I'd eaten rabbit before, and that's what it tasted like. It tasted like that. I've eaten really strange things in my life, and didn't like most of it. So. Anyway, they ate guinea pig. So the Spaniards came from a history of lots of food. And because they had lots of good food, they were able to maintain relatively large populations. They come from a history of the Fertile Crescent. Wheat, barley, peas, and lentils, of course, come from this area. And you can grow these as crops, and you can feed lots of individuals. And that's why Europe was so strong. One of the reasons they were so strong is because of the foods that they had to eat. There were no sheep in the Americas. There were no goats in America. In the Americas, there were mountain goats, of course. You guys didn't have any pigs, you didn't have any donkeys, and you didn't have any cows. But they did in the Fertile Crescent. And because of that, they had all the meat that they wanted. They could eat beef, they could eat pork, they could eat mutton. So they had all of these animals that grew very well. But unfortunately, they started living with these animals. And when you live with these animals, whatever diseases that animal has will mutate so that it can infect humans. Especially pigs. Pigs have a very similar immune system to humans. So for that reason, a lot of diseases come out of pigs. You remember the swine flu from a number of years ago, or maybe you don't. There was a flu called the swine flu. There was a flu about 5 years ago called the Mexican flu. They started off calling it the Mexican flu, but it actually came from pigs. But it came out of Mexico, so we changed the name to swine flu. So we had another outbreak of swine flu. About 40 years ago, we had an outbreak, no, it was longer than that. It was about 50 years ago, 55 years ago, we had an outbreak of swine flu that killed all kinds of people in the United States. But it was another type of flu that came specifically from pigs. So because we lived with these animals, of course, we developed all of these bacteria at the same time. Now this is a good thing and a bad thing. It's actually a bad thing. We're living with our animals, and therefore we're creating all these horrible diseases. And that's what I just talked about. All of these diseases are viruses, except for tuberculosis. It's a bacterial infection. So all of these came from us living with our animals. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and of course tuberculosis. Originally was an animal disease that mutated, and it's a bacteria that mutated, and now it's a really serious problem. We thought we had tuberculosis eradicated. We thought we had smallpox eradicated. We thought we had the measles eradicated. Because now we have vaccines that can stop these things. But of course, they've all come back. We thought we had tuberculosis controlled, but now it's come back. And it's come back in areas where people don't get inoculated. We saw a smallpox outbreak in Syria because of the warfare taking place there. So we had a smallpox outbreak. We thought we had it eradicated. Tuberculosis, where are we seeing tuberculosis? In the homeless communities, where individuals refuse to be medicated. These are the individuals that we're seeing with these problems now. So these diseases came out of the Middle East. For thousands of years, diseases swept through the cities and towns of Eurasia, killing off millions but leaving populations of people immune to these scourges. Bubonic plague wiped out millions and millions of people. Started in the Middle East. When these diseases were introduced to the uninitiated populations in the Americas, the lack of immunity wiped out whole nations. And Michelle knows this. The white clay people of Montana talk about their 600 lodges. It was reduced to 60 because of smallpox. They had so many dead people that they didn't have any place to bury them. They were very fastidious about burying people. They buried them up in the mountains, in between rocks. That's where they buried them. There were so many people that died, they had to start putting people up into trees, up into cottonwood trees. It was that bad. So many people died. And of course the Blackfeet suffered a similar fate when they were introduced with smallpox. Really serious problem, as horrible as that sounds. We don't know how many people were in the Americas. We have no clue. And there's a huge argument going on. Some people estimate that there were as many as 100 to 200 million people living in South America and North America. But if we look at the history books written by Europeans, they will tell you that there were maybe 1 million people, maybe up to 10 million people. Well, there's a hell of a lot of difference between 100 million and 10 million. How many people were actually here? There's a reason why they don't want to admit how many people were here. It's because they killed all those people, one way or another. They like to think that they conquered the Americas. But the reality is probably that the Americas were conquered by disease. Estimations of 99% of the population dying because of these diseases. Remember, the Europeans had tens of thousands of years to gain immunity to these problems. So a smallpox epidemic would kill off a half a dozen people in Boston, and it would wipe out whole villages of Native Americans because they had no immunity to it. Now, one of the tragedies of the indigenous Americans is that it was the fault of the way that you did things. If somebody got sick, then you would call in a healer, and the whole family would gather around. Well, if it was smallpox, now all of a sudden, all those people have smallpox. How many of them are going to survive? Maybe 1 out of 100 would survive. As horrible as that is. Anyway, that's one of the ways that they conquered the Americans. Okay. So it has a lot to do with the environment. It has a lot to do with the things that you're around. One of the things that happened to me when I went off to Vietnam was that I got sick. I got sick almost right away. I wasn't used to the environment in Vietnam. And I got dysentery, except it wasn't really dysentery. They could have treated dysentery. This was just me reacting to the environment. A lot of people who travel down in Mexico, because the food is different, they get sick. They get a form of dysentery. They get diarrhea. And sometimes they can almost die. When I went to Guatemala, I caught a parasite, which is endemic there. Everybody's got it down there. It doesn't kill them. It almost killed me. It almost killed several of us, actually. It's a relatively new parasite. I'm trying to think of the name. Cyclospora is what it's called. Anyway, we caught cyclospora from eating chicken that wasn't cooked all the way through. We got cyclospora. And it took months to get rid of it. And one of us almost died. He had to be hospitalized. But it was after he came back to the States. So if you're not used to an area, if you're not used to the environment, then potentially you're going to get sick. And this is one of the reasons why people don't travel to areas that are less civilized. We don't just wander off into the jungle of South America, because potentially one of the things that will happen to us is that we'll get sick. If we're wheat eaters and we go to Japan or to China, to southern China, or we go to Vietnam where everybody eats rice for every meal, and we're not rice eaters, and we try to live by eating their food, we're going to get sick. That's just the way it works. Anyway, I couldn't handle their food. And I didn't really eat any of their food. That's the strange part. I just ate food that had been in the country and it had been contaminated with their environment. China is a large country in Eastern Asia. In the north, the people eat and grow wheat. It's cooler up here. It's very humid in the south. It's more like here in the north. So they grow a lot of wheat in the north. In the south, where it is warmer and more humid, they grow and eat rice. Because there's a vast difference between growing rice and growing wheat, the two areas have developed different social structures. This is really kind of fascinating. So we can look at China and we can see that people that live where they grow wheat live one lifestyle, and people that live where they grow rice live a totally different lifestyle. Rice is cultivated in paddies. If you've ever been in a rice paddy, they also fertilize this with human waste. It stinks. I think it stinks. I'm not a real fan of human waste. And it's in standing water. So they have a lot of mosquitoes. There has to be sufficient rainfall where it is channeled through irrigation canals. So it's usually in an area that gets a lot of rain. There's a lot of, they flood these fields in the spring so that they can plant their rice. This requires a great deal of coordination and cooperation between the farmers, because usually you have a water source, and the water source comes from one place. So a farmer that controls this water source, he could not allow any other farmers to grow any rice, but that's not the way it works. They have to cooperate, they have to coordinate. Usually the guy that is at the head of the water source is the wealthiest guy in the area, because everybody pays him money to send water their way. So there's a lot of coordination, there's a lot of cooperation. Rice farming is labor intensive, often requiring work by whole families. You'll see little kids out there planting rice plants, as horrible as that sounds. So it's extremely labor intensive. If you've ever seen anybody plant wheat, and I used to live on a farm where we grew wheat and soybeans, it takes one guy. It takes one guy to plant a field of wheat, with a tractor, of course. But even if you didn't have a tractor, it'd still take just that one guy. It doesn't take much. You plant the stuff, and then you let it grow. That's it. You don't have to worry about it. You may have to go out and weed it a couple times during the summertime, but it's primarily, it's not that labor intensive. So you can grow a lot of wheat without doing very much. You have to plow the field, you have to plant the field, and you have to potentially weed the field a couple times, and that's all there is to it. If you're growing rice, you have to be out in the field every day. Wheat farming is done in fields that rarely require irrigation. Wheat farmers do not have to cooperate with their neighbors. Wheat farming is far less labor intensive than anything else. So you can be the biggest jackass in the world as a wheat farmer, but if you're a jackass as far as the rice farming goes, then you're not going to get your rice crop in. But wheat farming, don't have to worry about it. Looking at people from northern and southern China, researchers discovered that rice growers from the south showed more interdependent thinking styles. They have to be, because they have to be able to coordinate and cooperate with other individuals. So that's the type of individuals they are. People in the north look different than people in the south. People in the south have different shaped eyes. People in the north have rounder eyes, as confusing as that is. People in the south are darker complexion than people in the north. Why? Because they spend more time outside. If you're a wheat farmer, you don't have to go outside. So you tend to be paler looking. The reality is, these two individuals, whether you're from the south or from the north, you come from the same genetic stock. But because of the environment, you look different and you act different. People from the south see themselves as part of a network. They're more collectivistic in the south than they are in the north. They were tolerant of nepotism. Remember, you've got the guy that controls the water. And he's going to give his land to his sons. So nepotism is very strong in the south. It's not in the north. They engaged in more holistic reasoning because they think more globally, because they have to take in, well, what is Charlie over here thinking? What is the person over here thinking? I've got to coordinate all of that because I'm not going to get my rice crop in unless I get my water and unless I plant my fields. So cooperation is very important. So they're far more collectivistic in the south than they are in the north. And if we look at the history of China, it's always been the rice area of China trying to protect itself from these wild people from the north, these wild tribes from the north. That's one of the reasons why they built the Great Wall. They were trying to protect themselves from all of these crazy people living on the other side. All these wacko people, these individualistic people. You never knew what they were thinking. If I'm from the south, I know exactly what everybody's thinking because that's the way my mind works. I have to understand what you think so that I can get along with you so that I can grow my rice. But in the north, they have thoughts that are all over the place. So the northern tribes are the ones that were the rebellious ones. And the southern tribes were trying to protect themselves. So all the largest cities in China are all in the south. Beijing, Shanghai, Chongqing, all of these areas, they would accumulate a lot of people. And the people were able to live with one another. If you go to the north, it looks like farm fields because they're northerners. And the northern Chinese, and they make fun of each other all the time. The northern Chinese make fun of the southern Chinese, and southern Chinese certainly make fun of the northern Chinese because they have no idea what they're thinking. They're just like crazy dogs, which is the term that they use, which is not a complimentary term. Evoke culture is the idea that people, no matter where they are from, have certain biologically encoded behavioral patterns that can be evoked when a certain circumstance arises. So if you were from southern China, of course, you're used to thinking about other individuals and maintaining cooperation and trying to get along with everybody else. If you're from the north, of course, you have a different idea. You're more individualistic. So you can have whatever ideas that you want to have. When threatened, the capacity to act in an intimidating manner is universally present, especially when loved ones are threatened. Now, one of the things we found out was that the people in the north are far more violent than the people in the south. People in the south will defend themselves, but they tend to not be very aggressive. How about that? So if you run into somebody from the north, they're more likely to punch your lights out. If there's somebody from the south, if you attack them, they will defend themselves, but they won't attack you. Really confusing, isn't it? This is telling us a ton about the Koreans. This is telling us a ton about the Chinese during World War II, the Vietnamese. So right now, we've got South Korea and North Korea. It's much colder in the north than it is in the south. And the north looks like they may attack, and nobody knows what they're thinking. Well, you never know what they're thinking. Another example of evoke culture is attractiveness in a mate. People around the world prefer mates who are physically attractive. Everybody wants an attractive mate. Why in the world would you want an attractive mate? Well, it turns out that attractive mates probably don't have any parasites. They don't have any scars. If you have parasites, of course, you're small. You tend to be fragile and thin because of the parasites. Attractive people are healthier, and that's one of the reasons why we're looking for attractiveness in a mate. I'm going to my 50th high school reunion. 2 of my classmates have trophy wives. One's a doctor, and the other one is a city planner. Both of them have trophy wives. Very, very attractive women. Very slender women. They spend their day being attractive. They exercise. They put on makeup. Neither of them have worked a day in their lives. They've been taken care of all their lives. But they're attractive. And so both of these individuals have married somebody that looks good. Trophy wives. Wealthy people often do this. I'm not going to use Donald Trump and Melania as an example, or Marla Maples, or Ivana Trump, but I could if I wanted to. Humans have inherited preferences for attractive mates. Now, the interesting thing is that sometimes this is extremely prevalent, and sometimes it's not. Some of the most attractive women that I've ever met, and I don't normally talk about attractive women, but some of the most attractive women I've ever met were from Pakistan and Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. If you've ever been around people from that country, their women tend to be very, very attractive. Why is that? Because of the environment that they live in. Men marry attractive women. What do they get to see of the women? If you know anything about Muslim marriage cultures, what do you get to see? You get to see what their face looks like? So what do you get to see?
What is that picture?
What,
Is it
this?
talking about the face structure of the person?
Yeah, they're talking about face structures and how different face structures are attractive. Are seen as attractive. So guess what is the most striking feature of these women? Well, the most beautiful woman I ever met was from Afghanistan. I worked with her. And every time I looked at her, I started drooling. I mean, she was that pretty. She made all the other women in the office look like, barking dogs. But there was one, and she had a speech impediment. If she got excited, she could barely talk. And so she would, it wasn't a stutter, it was like she was drawing in air. It was really kind of interesting. So you wouldn't want to marry somebody with a speech impediment, because that might be genetic. But there was something about her that was so strikingly attractive that it was almost blinding. So if you think about the people, the Muslim women, and what they do, and how do you select a mate? There's only one thing that you get to see, and that's the eyes. She had the most attractive eyes I've ever seen. Just perfect. They were perfect. And she had a sister that was just as pretty as she was. It was really kind of irritating. I didn't leave my wife, but she had a flat tire one day and I did change her tire. When there is little threat of parasites or an unhealthy environment, other criteria can be used to select a mate. So we don't have to worry about this stuff. If we live in a relatively benign world where there's no danger of anything, then we can use other criteria, such as, is she intelligent? Or he, whichever the case may be. Are they kind? Do they have a sense of humor? So we live in the United States where it is a relatively benign environment. We really don't have to worry about this kind of stuff. So we're not really looking for attractiveness as the main criteria. And if we look at some of the actresses from the past and look at actresses currently, some of the actresses, some of the more popular actresses aren't really that attractive. But they have good personalities. As confusing as that may be. Okay. So if we're talking about like the prettiest lady that's in the movies today, who would that could that possibly be? It's easier to find a really pretty guy than it is to find a really pretty woman, if you think about it. So who's really, really pretty? In the old days, we had Marilyn Monroe, we had Elizabeth Taylor, just really physically attractive women. But who do we have today that's popular? Who's the most popular actress in the United States? In Hollywood today? I can't think of anybody right off the top of my head. Now I'm going to have to go to the internet and see that.
Emma Stone is the highest paid actress right now. She's from Scottsdale.
Okay.
But that's being the highest paid actress.
Right. So how attractive is she? On a scale of 1 to 10, would you say she's a 10?
She's the most desired.
No, but is she attractive is the question. Or is it her personality? Does she seem intelligent? Does she seem kind? Does she have a sense of humor? I don't know.
She seems funny in her movies.
Yeah. So
Right.
I would say the personality on that part.
It seems to be, right? She's really not that attractive. She's not drop dead gorgeous.
I think most people don't really go for redheads, but I don't think she's...
She has freckles.
There's a reason why we don't go for redheads. They're very sensitive to the sun. Okay. I don't know if her hair's really red anyway. Prettiest women in Hollywood.
Probably Kim Kardashian. The Kardashians
She's not even
are
an
popular.
actress. She's just a reality television star.
Angela Jolie.
Angelina Jolie doesn't have any, has had cancer surgery.
What about Jennifer Lawrence?
Here we go. Megan Fox, Mila Kunis,
I was gonna say
Melanie
Megan Fox.
Iglesias, Scarlett Johansson, Jessica Biel, Jennifer Lawrence. I don't even know what Jessica Biel looks like. Kate Upton. Only one of these individuals is a model, and that's Kate Upton.
Yeah.
The rest of them are actresses. Megan Fox, I saw her in one of the Transformer movies. She is a very attractive woman. 20 hottest female celebrities in business. Oh, wait a minute, that's Men's Fitness. What are we going to get? I don't know. I have no idea. There's Jennifer Lawrence. When I saw her in,
Hunger Games.
yeah, thank you, Hunger Games. Hunger Games, I didn't think she was attractive at all. I was thinking, is she the star? Really? She's not that pretty. Wait a minute. View gallery. Okay. I'm not very good at this stuff.
Yeah, I think she was a model before turning an actress.
Was that right? Scarlett Johansson.
Well, in her teen years.
Scarlett Johansson. I don't know. Drop dead gorgeous? I don't know. Jessica Biel. Kind of got a big mouth. I don't know. If she were in my high school class, I don't think I'd want to date her. Sorry. Jennifer Lawrence, of course, again, fairly common-looking individual, don't you think?
Yeah.
Megan Fox. No, I'll have to admit, Megan Fox is fairly attractive. Mila Kunis. Yeah, she's pretty. Melanie Iglesias, fairly common-looking. Kate Upton has the worst voice in the world. My God, she sounds like She talks through her nose. Like there's something wrong with her voice. Michelle Rodriguez, I didn't even know this. She's not bad looking. Amber Heard. Julianne Hough, I have no idea who she is. But she's super talented. She sings and dances as well as anyone in Hollywood. Vanessa Hudgens has lupus. She has lupus. No, she's not the one with lupus. Who's the one with lupus? It's the one that was dating. It's the one that was dating Justin Bieber. Selena Gomez. She has lupus. She's half Filipino. As interesting as that is. Lauren Cohen, Minka Kelly. She's not even pretty.
Is she an actress?
I don't know who she is. She lights up the red carpet, whoever she is. She's not even pretty. Jamie Chung, not bad looking. Rihanna, as long as her boyfriend's not beating her up, she's okay. Elsa Pataki, I don't know this lady. She's not very pretty either, is she?
What about the lady in the Wonder Woman, the movie?
Yeah, you know, the reason I think she's pretty is because she's so strong. I admire muscles. This is Jessica Alba. She's a dream queen. I don't know what that means. Maria Menounos. I don't know her either. She's not bad looking. Sophia Bush. I don't know her either. Beyonce's kind of big. Okay, interesting group. Not really all that attractive. This is really fascinating to me.
We were looking at like red carpet pictures where they're like super
Done up?
Yeah, it's super done.
Well, that's what all of those pictures were. They were all red carpet pictures. If we take them out of their makeup, what do they look like?
And a lot of them have plastic surgery.
That's true. To improve something, to make their nose thinner. For some reason, they're trying to make their nose look thin. One of the reasons they want a thin-looking nose and a sharp chin and high cheekbones is because that's the way pubescent women look. The younger they are, the more they look like that. And of course, that's what that's what men are attracted to. Women who can reproduce. So if you're talking about somebody in their 50s, they're trying to keep their face looking like somebody in their 20s because then they are reproductive potential. And men find that attractive. Okay. Anyway, that's all we've got about evoke culture. And actually, the rest of this is about evoke culture as well. I just find this fascinating. Who is it that we are going to be attracted to in the future? And maybe our actors and actresses will not be the best looking ones, but the ones with good personalities. If we look at actors, of course, men are a totally different story than females, right? We don't, women, unless women have a lot of money, then attractiveness is not important. Women are looking for security. So you can have common looking people like Dustin Hoffman, not the most attractive man in the world.
What about personality?
You're looking for more personality because it has to do with somebody you can get along with. So as long as you're not in a really stressed environment, then all of this stuff can be very, very important. People were really surprised that Melania Trump is as intelligent as she is. Why? Because nobody thought about asking her any questions before. She was just a face. She was just a body. But now that she's the first lady, of course she has to get along with a lot of people. Turns out she speaks 5 different languages, none of which are Russian. I looked that up to see. She was sitting beside Putin and I was thinking, oh my God, they're having this long conversation about spying in the United States. But she doesn't speak Russian. She's from Slovakia. When people learn cultural practices by social learning or by modeling others, it is known as transmitted culture. So if I watch you do something, and I'd have to watch you plant corn around here, because where I come from, you just throw the seed in the ground and it grows. But I would imagine there are things you have to do around here because the environment is so different from what I'm used to. Where I come from, the dirt is black and rich, and it gets a lot of rain. Yesterday, or not, over the weekend, I planted a tree, only because somebody threw it out, and I decided, oh, what the hell, let's see if this thing grows. So I dug a hole, and I got down about 6 inches, and the ground was hard as a rock. I thought maybe I dug into a rock, but it wasn't, it was dirt. So in order to get deeper, I had to get some water and pour the water into the hole to soften up the dirt, otherwise I couldn't shovel it. Now, we don't have to worry about that in Iowa. You can dig down as far as you want, and it's moist. It's moist all the way down. But here, of course, you've got hard pan. And in order to get through the hard pan, you have to soak it in water to make it soft so that you can dig it. A pack of dogs killed one of my cats last year, and I had to bury the cat. I wasn't exactly sure what to do with it. I probably broke all kinds of laws by burying my cat. But what do you do with a dead cat?
You feed it to the dogs.
Feed it to the dogs. No, I was going to bury the cat. So, yeah, it took me about an hour to bury that cat. Cats aren't that big. You don't have to dig that big a hole, but getting it to go deeper was hard, was difficult. So I had to pour water into the hole. But I've done this before. Montana was the same way. In Montana, you could go down about maybe 8 or 9 inches, and then you had to soak it. Of course, there's a lot of rocks up there as well. Anyway. So if you guys would have to show me how to plant corn around here. Of course, where I come from, it just grows really tall without any problem at all. We get all the rain we need. If you watch your neighbor growing tomatoes in a hanging pot, you have learned such planting practices by observation. And of course, my wife keeps watching things on YouTube, and then she tries to garden in what she's seen. And of course, half these places are in California or Arizona, and so she's adopting practices from someplace else, and they don't work in Iowa. One year we planted a garden, and it rained so much that spring, or in the early part of the summer, that all of our seeds rotted in the ground because of the moisture. I know. So these are things that you need to know in that part of the world. You're not going to get a garden if it rains too much in the spring. Despite the fact that the Dinka and the Nuer have lived beside each other for hundreds of years, and they are both nomadic cattle herders, and they eat the same foodstuffs, and descended from the same ancestors 1,000 years ago, their cultures are completely different. As you can see, the Dinka make scars going around their heads, and the Nuer make straight scars going in a V pattern. Oh, I got a clock right there. What am I talking about? And that's the difference between the two cultures. No, that's not the difference between the two cultures. The Nuer raise large herds of cattle, and they live off the milk. They don't butcher the cattle. They just live off the milk. The Dinka butcher their herds, and they rely on the meat. So who gets the most protein? Who gets the most protein? You get more protein from milk, or you get more protein from meat?
Meat.
You know, I think you're right. I think you get more from the meat. The Dinka maintain tribal relationships by which families they live near. So if I live near Jeff and Chris, you are my cultural structure. I will maintain a relationship because you guys are close to me. Does that make sense? However, if I were a Nuer, my kinships are based on the male line. So you guys don't have anything to do with me. I don't care about you because you're not related to me. My relationships have to do with who I'm related to, who I'm blood related to, not who I live near. The Nur are larger and they are more materialistic, militaristic. Phew. Militaristic. A long weekend, I tell you. I walked my dog all weekend. That's all I did. And plant that tree. I planted a tree. And I did, I graded stuff all weekend. I was brain dead yesterday. I had looked at so many postings from so many people. So the Nur have a larger tribe and they're more militaristic. Their relationship structure is more linear because it follows father to son, grandfather to father to son, in that manner. The Nur maintain costly and flexible dowry payments for their daughters, while the Dinka have small, flexible payments. And for that reason, it's much easier to get married if you're a Dinka. But Dinka do not marry Nur. And the reason they don't marry Nur is because if it's a female, then she has to pay a really large dowry that the Dinka don't even think about. So they never intermarry, even though they live right next to each other. One tribe and the other. They have exactly the same ancestors. They look exactly alike except for the scars. But they don't interact hardly at all. They don't even eat the same food. If I'm Dinka, man, I'm out there butchering my cows, and the Nur are going, oh my God, look at all the milk that you just lost. Of course, if you just butcher the males, you don't have to worry about the spears. Biological evolution occurs when certain genes become more common in a population than they were in the past. Biological evolution operates through natural selection, of course. Natural selection is the evolutionary process that occurs under these conditions. The individual variability exists among members of a species in a certain trait, on certain traits. The traits are associated with different reproductive rates, and the traits have a hereditary basis. And that has to do with biological evolution. There's a reason why the Neanderthal no longer exists around the world. Something happened. And it probably had something to do with biological evolution. If we select our reproductive partners by the way that they look, and we're looking for a certain trait, and that trait is relatively rare, then we're not going to have as many children. A good example is breast size. In some parts of the world, women don't have very large breasts. In other parts of the world, they have really large breasts. If that were a selection process, if I selected a mate by the size of her chest, and I was in a population with relatively small chests, then those women would have a difficult time finding somebody to mate with. If I'm in a population with large breasts, and this is my selection process, and actually breasts have been selected at different junctures in different societies around the world. If I'm in a population where everyone has large breasts, then it would be easy for me to find a mate to reproduce with. Of course, the reverse is true as well. In Asia, where they don't have very large breasts, being large-chested excludes someone from reproduction, as confusing as all that is. So this is what happened. In Japan after World War II, the Japanese who couldn't find anybody to marry needed a job, so they would go to the military bases to find a job. And of course, if they were too large-chested, the Japanese men didn't want to marry them. But of course, the American GIs who used this as a selection process found them to be far more attractive. And these women were shocked that the American men were so stupid that they found them attractive. But the American men, and of course the American men married them and took them home and whatnot. But of course the women thought that there was something wrong with them because they found them attractive. When of course they lived all their lives knowing that they weren't attractive at all. The other thing that happened was that in Japan, women tend to be relatively slender. And of course that is part of the selection process as well. So a woman that had a little meat on her bones, of course, is not selected by the Japanese male. Now if you live in a culture where these are the rules, of course you think that that's the rule for everybody because that's all you know. So here are these women, they're going to the American military bases and they're finding themselves being fought over by all these crazy round-eyed men. It was really kind of bizarre. The whole selection process had changed. And this has to do with biological evolution. If it has to do with something reproductive. If it had to do with long noses, Cyrano de Bergerac or whatever, then we would all have long noses. That's just the way it works. So we use different criteria as our selection process, for our selection process. Okay, fast-running antelope may have an advantage in outrunning their predators. These are the fastest antelope in the world. They are the antelope of Montana. I'm trying to think what they're called. Why can't I think of it? I don't know. It's fleeing me. I don't know. Can't remember what they are. Anyway, they're the pronghorns. They're pronghorns. The trade-off would be that their increased muscle mass would require increased food to maintain themselves. They're of course able to maintain themselves up in Montana. The interesting thing about these animals is that they can't bend over to get through, they can't crawl under something. Okay, so they need open range, as interesting as that is. They're pronghorns. Fastest antelope in the world. Slow-running antelope may be more susceptible to predators, but in a time of drought, when the food sources are limited, they're more likely to survive than fast-running antelope, because the fast-running antelope need excessive amounts of food. This animal is able to maintain more body fat, therefore it's able to survive in a drought condition. And of course, this is an African antelope. Is all that logical? Okay. We were talking about food. Right, we're talking about food. If you think about the reservation years, the years they started putting the reservations together, what they were trying to do was control the tribes. They were trying to control the fact that they couldn't make war on the American government. For that reason, what they did, they put people on reservations and then they gave them food. That's what was supposed to have happened at Bosque Redondo. But the food that they gave the different tribes was their own food. And because it was their own food, it wasn't as rich as the food that the natives were used to getting. And because of that reason, a lot of people starved to death on the reservations. One of the things that happened in Montana, fascinating, if you read some of the stories coming out of those times when they were actually feeding the tribes, one of the things that happened, they would give them oatmeal. Of course, nobody had ever seen oatmeal before. Even if they were shown how to cook oatmeal, if you've ever tasted oatmeal, it has no flavor. It doesn't taste like anything. It tastes like nothing. It tastes like dirt. So they were giving them some of their foodstuffs as grains, as oatmeal, and of course the natives were just throwing it out. They were just getting rid of it because they didn't know how to cook it, didn't know what to do with it. So they just threw it away. So here the American, the federal government thinks that they're giving all these people all this food, and the reality is some of it was inedible as far as they were concerned. One of the things that happened during World War II, they had guerrilla groups that would come out of the mountains of Thailand, and they would go into China to fight against the Japanese. And sometimes they would get wounded, these Chins, these individuals coming out of Thailand, and they would be taken to the English hospitals, and they would die. Despite what kind of wounds they had, they were trying to feed them English food, which is fairly bland food. And because of that, these individuals would die. Oh, it's almost time to go. Okay. Cultural evolution is where ideas are carried forward from one generation to the next. Cultural evolution follows natural selection, as some ideas are more selectable in a culture than others. Religions and political structures seem to be two things that have followed us throughout our history, especially Western men. Actually, a lot of the political structures of the United States were not Western. They were Western ideas, but they were being utilized here in the United States among the indigenous peoples. The 7 tribes of the Algonquians, they actually had a political system that is very similar to the system that we use today. And that is, of course, an evolutionary structure. And that clock is wrong, isn't it? Isn't that clock wrong? It's like 4 minutes off.
Yeah.
Okay, I apologize.
11:54.
I need to start thinking like that. It says right here on my computer. I'm sorry. I'll see you guys next time, and I'll see you next week. Remember, no class on Thursday, because I will be driving to Albuquerque to catch a plane to go see my